there's constantly people learning that I'm not just a bass player or so. I think a lot of people just kind of view me as the kid that was in Van Halen that they hate.
The stage is a cavern of silence, the kind that echoes with the ghosts of 1,000 sold-out arenas. In the center stands a man, not a titan of rock, but a son clutching a guitar like a life raft in a rising tide of grief. We open not on the roar of the crowd, but on the sterile, rhythmic hum of a hospital room, the moment the music died for the world, and the light went out for a boy named Wolfgang. It was the day the legendary Edward Van Halen became a memory, leaving his son to navigate a labyrinth of legacy and loss under the suffocating weight of a name that had conquered the world. The air is thick with the scent of antiseptic and old wood. The transition from the greatest guitar god to a frail man taking a final breath is a tragedy too heavy for any lens to capture. How does a child survive when his North Star vanishes? How do you find your own voice when the world only wants to hear the echo of your father's? We are left to wonder. In the shadow of a king, can a prince ever truly become his own man? Or is he destined to be the keeper of a tomb? The California sun bleeds across the manicured lawns of the 5150 estate, casting long, skeletal shadows that seem to reach toward the recording studio, a bunker of redwood and history. Inside, the air is a thick, stagnant cocktail of stale cigarette smoke, the ozone of heated vacuum tubes, and the metallic tang of soldering irons. For the world, this was the laboratory of a god, the birthplace of the brown sound that redefined the electric guitar. But for a young Wolfgang, it was simply the smell of home, a sanctuary where the line between father and icon was perpetually blurred. He moved through these rooms not as a fan, but as an observer of the quiet, agonizing labor behind the genius. He watched the man the world worshipped struggle with the simple mechanics of a day, seeing the way his father's legendary hands would tremble when the cameras weren't flashing. To the public, Edward was a supernova. To Wolfgang, he was a delicate, brilliant light that he felt a constant, crushing need to shield from the wind. While other children were occupied with the trivialities of youth, Wolfgang was mastering a much darker curriculum, the frequency of his father's heartbreak. He became an expert in the subtle shifts of Edward's mood, the way a certain silence in the room signaled a descent into the psychological abyss that often accompanies such profound creativity. There was a profound, silent weight to this inheritance. It was a psychological cage built of gold and platinum records. Wolfgang carried an internal burden far beyond his years, acting as a quiet sentinel for a hero who was increasingly fragile. His decision to eventually pick up the bass and join the ranks was never about the allure of the spotlight or the hunger for fame. It was a desperate, tactical maneuver of the heart. He entered the fray because the stage was the only place where he could remain within arm's reach of his father, a way to tether him to the earth as he drifted dangerously close to the edge of his own mortality. The tours became a blur of high-decibel roar and backstage whispers. Wolfgang stood in the shadows of the stage left, his eyes never leaving the man in the center. He wasn't just playing the notes, he was monitoring the heartbeat of the legacy. He saw the sweat that wasn't just from the lights, but from the sheer exertion of a man fighting his own body to remain the titan everyone expected. There was a tragic beauty in their synchronization, a son giving his youth to preserve his father's twilight. They shared a language of nods and fleeting smiles that bypassed the roar of the crowd, a private dialogue between two people who were the only ones who knew the cost of the name they shared. But as the final tour progressed, the atmosphere began to change. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the early days was replaced by something colder, something sterile. Wolfgang began to hear it in the gaps between the solos, a terrifying lack of resonance. As the lights dimmed on their final performance together, Wolfgang stood in the cooling silence of the wings and noticed a devastating shift. A hollow, eerie silence in his father's playing that suggested the music wasn't just fading with age. It was being systematically stolen by an invisible thief. The silence that followed the funeral was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, predatory quiet that settled over the 5150 studio like a thick layer of ash. In the wake of Edward's passing, Wolfgang did not seek the comfort of the son. Instead, he retreated into a fortress of isolation, bolting the doors against a world that was already clamoring for him to pick up the mantle. The psychological pressure of the Van Halen name ceased to be an abstract concept and became a physical entity, a shroud woven from decades of expectation, threatening to smother his own creative pulse before it could find its rhythm. He moved through the darkened hallways of the studio like a ghost haunting his own life, his footsteps echoing against the redwood walls that had once vibrated with the energy of 1,000 masterpieces. The nights were the longest. Wolfgang would sit for hours in the dim glow of the mixing console, surrounded by a forest of guitars that still seemed to hold the warmth of his father's touch. Every instrument was a relic, every amplifier a monument to a genius he felt he could never replicate. He wasn't merely grieving a parent. He was navigating the wreckage of a shattered identity. To the public, he was the heir, the one destined to keep the fire burning, to be the carbon copy the fans craved. But inside the hollow of his chest, something else was stirring. His soul was screaming for a departure, a desperate need to find a frequency that didn't belong to his father. Yet, the guilt of that desire felt like a betrayal. Every time he reached for a guitar, he felt the suffocating weight of history, a visceral fear that anything he created would be viewed as a hollow imitation or, worse, a desecration of a sacred legacy. This was the deep darkness of the transition. He lived in a psychological purgatory, trapped between the man he was expected to be and the artist he feared he might never become. The air in the studio felt thin, starved of the oxygen of inspiration. He would record fragments of melodies, only to erase them moments later, convinced they were either too close to his father's style or not close enough to satisfy the world's hunger. He was spiraling into a void of self-doubt, convinced that the only way to survive the shadow of the king was to step out of the light entirely. He began to believe that the Van Halen name was not a bridge to the future, but a pedestal that had become a tomb. He felt the crushing urge to destroy the image everyone had built for him, to burn the map and disappear into the silence he had grown to inhabit. The isolation was absolute. He stopped answering the phone. The messages from industry giants and well-meaning friends went unread. He was a man drowning in a sea of mahogany and steel. One evening, the weight finally became too much to bear. He began the grim task of covering the equipment with plastic sheets, the crinkling sound like the tearing of skin. He decided that he would walk away, leaving the guitars to gather dust, choosing the dignity of silence over the humiliation of being a shadow. He reached into the back of a cluttered desk drawer to retrieve his keys, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. Just as he prepared to pack away the guitars and seal the studio forever, his hand closed around a dusty demo tape buried beneath a mountain of old cables. A recording of his father playing a haunting, singular melody Wolfgang had never heard in all his years, and resting beside it was a handwritten note with a single sentence that changed the trajectory of his grief forever. The transformation did not begin with a burst of light, but in the grueling, subterranean labor of the soul. Wolfgang stood alone in the center of the studio, the air stilled by the weight of a monumental decision. To move forward, he had to shed the skin of the sun, that protective, dutiful layer he had worn for 30 years, and allow the raw, unformed artist to emerge. This was the birth of Mammoth WVH, an undertaking that was less a recording project and more an act of solitary penance. The setting was intimate and claustrophobically quiet. The sprawling 5150 complex, once a playground of collaborative genius, had been distilled into a private confessional. Here, Wolfgang became his own choir and his own congregation. He picked up the drumsticks, the bass, and the guitar, determined to play every note himself. Not out of ego, but out of a psychological necessity to prove he existed independently of the ghost in the room. He found himself wrestling with his father, not as a rival, but as a haunting, immovable standard of perfection. Every time he dialed in a tone or hummed a vocal harmony, he could feel the phantom presence of Edward leaning over the console, a silent judge of melody and grit. It was a tragic, beautiful paradox. Wolfgang realized that he had to lose his father to finally hear the rhythm of his own heart. The silence left by the Titan was the only space large enough for his own voice to resonate. He spent weeks chasing a single sound, driven by a perfectionism that was both a gift from his lineage and a curse of his own making. The psychological breakthrough arrived not in a moment of triumph, but in a moment of surrender. He understood at last that honoring a legacy did not mean standing eternally in the shade of the oak tree, but taking the seeds and planting them in a new, unmapped territory. This was his rise from the ashes, a slow-motion ascent fueled by the searing honesty of the song Distance. It was a track born of the profound space between the man who had given him everything and the man he was rapidly becoming. The recording process was an emotional bloodletting. He was no longer playing for the rafters or the history books, but for the clarity of his own survival. He was building an architecture of rebirth, brick by heavy brick, ensuring that every vibration was authentically his. He was no longer a satellite orbiting a sun. He was becoming a source of light in his own right. The music began to pulse with a life force that was distinctly mammoth, heavy, melodic, and deeply human. The album was finally complete, a masterwork of sweat and sorrow, but as the first single was released into the digital ether, a sudden and vicious wave of vitriol from the purists erupted, a storm of comparison and cruelty that threatened to drown his new identity before it could even draw its first breath. The roar of the crowd has changed. It is no longer a collective chant for a ghost, but a rhythmic, pulsing recognition of the man standing center stage. We see Wolfgang now, bathed in a spotlight that he no longer feels he has stolen. The camera lingers on his face, older, weathered by a grief that has finally begun to calcify into wisdom. He plays with a ferocious, liberated grace, his fingers dancing across the fretboard not in imitation, but in a language entirely his own. He no longer looks over his shoulder for the phantom nod of approval that once governed his every move. The stage, once a place of protective duty, has finally become a place of sovereign peace. The narrative arc, having weathered the storms of tragedy and the fires of public scrutiny, circles back to that initial origin wound. Yet the perspective has shifted. The trauma is no longer a jagged hole in his life. It has become the lens through which he views his purpose. He has performed the ultimate alchemy of the soul, transforming the leaden weight of loss into a bridge for others who walk through their own shadows. We explore his legacy through this new light, not as the fortunate son of a rock deity, but as a survivor of the highest order who navigated the impossible and emerged with his heart intact. The final scenes transition into a slow, cinematic meditation. Wolfgang returns to the 5150 studio, but the atmosphere is different now. The air is clear, the dust has settled, and the oppressive silence has been replaced by a resonant, living calm. He walks past the racks of guitars that once felt like headstones, touching them with a hand that is steady and sure. He recognizes, with a poignant finality, that he is not the closing sentence of the Van Halen story. He is the vibrant, necessary new chapter that ensures the book remains open. The tragedy did not break the man. It acted as a master sculptor, carving out the deep, hollow spaces within him so that his own soul finally had room to grow. He stands for a long moment in the center of the room where it all began, a silhouette against the glowing dials of the equipment. The journey from the hospital room to this moment of quiet triumph is etched in the set of his shoulders. He has honored the past by outgrowing it. He has kept the promise made in the silence. As he prepares to leave, there is no lingering sadness, only a profound, heavy sense of completion. He reaches for the master switch and turns off the studio lights, plunging the room into a darkness that no longer feels cold, leaving us with one haunting question. Now that the world finally knows Wolfgang, is he finally ready to say goodbye to the ghost of his father?